Welcome to Top Class with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're discussing teenage career preparation. Almost 40% of 15-year-old students are unclear about their career expectations, according to a new OECD report. Only a third have attended a job fair or completed an internship, and more than 20% have unrealistic job aspirations. These are just some of the findings of a new report called The State of Global Teenage Career Preparation. It paints a fairly damning picture of how well schools are doing at preparing teenagers for the world of work. To discuss the findings and what to do about it, I'm joined by a former OECD colleague who led the OECD's Career Readiness Project and was lead author of the report, Anthony Mann. Thank you for joining us, Anthony.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Duncan.
Lovely to see you. Now, this report has some concerning findings, I'll put it that way. What does it tell us about the career plans of teenagers around the world?
Well, as you started off, Duncan, the first thing we'd probably look at is this degree of uncertainty, because there are a number of problems which we find in the data. And I would say that overall it amounts to a crisis in the state of teenage career preparation. But let's look at that question of uncertainty. Now, as you said, it's 2 in 5, 40% of students now don't have a clear job plan. Now, at 15, we might think, well, maybe that's a bit early. But think about a couple of things. One is that in the year 2000, a generation ago, this figure was closer to 12%. So it's tripled since then. And then the other thing is that over recent years, there's been a wide range of studies which have used longitudinal data. So they've looked at the attitudes, the experiences of students, often at 15, typically at 15, and then see what happens to them later on. And what we find is that when they're older, and they're actually trying to find work, we find that there's a significant connection between uncertainty at 15 and poorer employment outcomes, higher unemployment, lower wages, often around the age of 25. And so uncertainty at 15 is really important because it tells us that they don't really have a clear idea. And it's at a time in most education systems where they're narrowing down the subjects which they're going to do. Are they going to go a vocational route or a general route? They need to have a compass, need to have some idea. They don't need to have a settled idea, that could change, probably will change, but they need to have an idea. So these PISA data firstly tells us that many are uncertain. And of those who do have a clear idea, well, it's increasingly concentrated around a small number of jobs. And so for girls, it's teachers, it's lawyers, it's doctors, as it was 20 years ago. For boys, it's information technology, it's being a professional sports person. That's number 2. It's engineers, as you look across the OECD data. Now, so about half of the boys and girls at 15 who tell us, give us a reply to the question we ask us, what type of job do you expect to have around the age of 30? Tell us they're going to be in a small number of jobs. And what we see is the big trend here over the last 20 years is that they're increasingly focused on one part of the labour market, and that's the professions. It is the engineers, it's the doctors, it's the teachers. And when we look at this, we see about 60% of students who have an idea about what they do say they're going to work in one of these jobs, one of these professions, high status, high paid. Now, 60% of them say they're going to do it, but typically across OECD countries, only 20% of people are actually employed in those areas. So we have 2 things. We have one, which is going to be huge amounts of competition for a small number of jobs, but also there's opportunity costs because they're not looking at some other areas. And other areas in the economy are very important, sometimes very fulfilling for young people, but also in strong demand and important to governments and societies and about how we operate our economies.
So doesn't this show then, from what you're saying, that something is fundamentally going wrong with education systems, where it's producing all these students who have these aspirations to go into certain jobs, but the numbers of jobs simply doesn't equate there aren't enough jobs out there to satisfy those students' aspirations?
Well, I mean, that is true. There is a problem. We need to look at this from two perspectives. One is the perspective of, our societies and economies and thinking about, kind of green jobs and healthcare and other strategically important areas. And will the new young talent be prepared for and understand, those areas? But also we need to think about it from perspectives of the student. That young person. Now, there's nothing wrong with young people having, ambitions which focus in one area. That's, perhaps we can understand it. It's increased a lot in the last 20 years. But what students really need to know is what they need to do to be able to achieve those ambitions and then have a really a broad exploration of the labour market. And one of the things you talked about in your introduction was unrealistic expectations. And let me just dig into that for a second, because we asked two really important questions in the PISA survey. One is that we ask them, what type of job do you expect to have? But we also ask them, what's the highest level of education you expect to complete? And what we find is that about 1 in 5 students has educational and occupational plans which are misaligned. Well, what we mean by that is that they say they're going to be a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, but they don't plan to go to university. They plan to finish education at 17, 18. And that suggests to me there's a lot of confusion out there about what you need to do in order to be able to achieve your ambitions. And we also know that if you're confused or misaligned in this way at 15, going back to those longitudinal studies which follow students all the way through into adulthood, there's a penalty to pay. So uncertainty and confusion, which is widespread, by no means is everybody, and some countries are better than others, but many, many students are confused or uncertain about what they will do, and there are penalties to pay for later on. And the thing which, really strikes me and I find most worrying is that those students who are most confused, most uncertain, are the low achievers, the low performers in the PISA tests, and students from the most disadvantaged social backgrounds.
Why is this the situation where students have these career aspirations, but they're not aware that they need to get a degree or whatever it is for the specific job? I mean, who's to blame here? Because schools surely have a responsibility to inform students about this kind of thing.
Well, I think in schools' defence, what we've seen over the last generation is a huge increase in educational success amongst young people. So the generation of young people are leaving education now more highly educated, more highly qualified, go into the labour market, more years of human capital formation, if you like, than any generation in history. It's remarkable what's happened over the last 20 to 30 years around the world in terms of educational achievement. But I think our problem is that we've seen a gulf emerge between what happens in the classroom and how that might relate to the world of work later on. And that's both the kind of exploration of the world of work, which is rapidly changing, as we all know, AI, green transition, things are changing very quickly. And young people, we know, have very narrow views and understanding about what involves in it, but also very practical activities which schools can do. And in this PISA data, the data from 2022, which became available just this year for us to really dig into, shows that surprisingly low numbers of young people are taking part in the sort of activities we can expect to be effective in helping them to explore the labour market and gain valuable experience to understand what different jobs are like and whether their ambitions might lie there. So job fairs, 45% of them say they've been to a job fair. A really important opportunity for young people to speak to people in work about the jobs they do, to broaden their understanding. We know that's particularly important. It kind of links to social capital theory, that young people are more likely to, kind of believe, take note of what somebody who actually does the job will say, rather than, a teacher, a parent, a careers advisor. Fewer than half of them have been to a workplace, with their school, or job shadowed, really important intervention. And, only a third of them have done an internship. And say, 15, we might think, well, it's a bit young these days. Kids are staying in education till they're in their 20s. But they make really important decisions at this point. And I think if we look across, kind of the OECD, some countries are better than others, but we find there's a general pattern that this part of the education has been neglected.
You talked about how fast the world of work is changing with AI, new technologies, the green revolution, and so on. And so is it fair to expect teachers to be able to advise students about all the different career opportunities out there? Because do teachers and parents, does anyone really understand all the changing nature of the world of work? Teachers are at school all day. They're not investigating and learning about the changing jobs markets because they're busy teaching kids. So I just wonder, is it fair to even expect teachers to be able to adequately guide students about all the opportunities out there?
Well, I don't think that we should expect teachers to do this. Even career guidance counselors. The world of work is changing. It's changing very rapidly. It's becoming more precarious in some ways. Some countries, it makes it more difficult to plot your career path through. We have lots of expectations and unknowns about how AI is transforming things. But what we can and we should expect them to do is to be gateways to the diversity of this professional world. Because in times of great economic occupational change, I think it's more important than ever to connect young people with people in work doing jobs which they may or may not be interested in or may never have heard of, to help in that exploration which is based upon an authentic and trusted inquiry. We need them to open up these gates and find simple ways to bring people in, to allow young people to explore those workplaces, spend time in those workplaces, because at times of great change, the least worst placed people are those who actually do the job. And, we don't know, how work is changing, how AI is changing research and tech and communications. It's all its fine details, but we do have we have a better idea than many other people. And so this comes down to this really critical issue of employer engagement. And we want to see effective guidance systems routinely bringing in people from the world of work, connecting them with young people from really quite a young age, certainly from primary school and very deeply at lower secondary education. Because what we find is that the more activities like this that young people have, the better they do later on. And so they're finding out things which they didn't know before. They're gaining confidence to see if it's going to be right for somebody like them. And they're learning what the sociologists often call the rules of the game. They're developing the cultural capital for understanding how they can present themselves well, how their educational choices and their training choices at a young age can either position them well or poorly towards making it more likely that they'll achieve their ambitions.
What you seem to be describing here is a complete revamp of the existing system where you want to see guidance being given to kids, like you say, in their primary years and having a lot more engagement with businesses coming in. Should this be something which schools do, head teachers try to make happen off their own back? Or is this something which you think should be more structured where policymakers need to get involved?
Well, I think we really need to have systemic approaches to making this happen. Finland is a good example of a country which does do this. They have, through lower secondary, every year they have a kind of a national system that enables schools to connect with employers, to bring those employers to connect with students, to have firstly one day in the labour market, in the world of work, then a week, and then maybe 2 weeks to build up and confirm their knowledge and understanding. Not all education systems have such an infrastructure which is in place to make it easy. But we see increasingly in countries that there's an awareness that this really works, that this is very beneficial to young people. And we find, incidentally, students who have a clearer vision for themselves, who are more engaged in career development, tend to be more engaged in education. They tend to be more, more focused in what they do in the classroom. Teachers like that, They want them to see the benefits of the work which they do. You want them to leave school and think that their school has actually helped them to prepare for and enter into the labour market. What we see in other countries is programs which are emerging, sometimes by non-governmental organisations or charities, which actively recruit and engage people in work and then make them available to schools. And, I say this should begin in primary school. That's because the attitudes that young people have about themselves, what's reasonable for kind of people like me to do, begins at a young age. And we can see that very clearly when we think about kind of gender, and we can think in terms of people's social backgrounds, but also it kind of helps foster that curiosity and that ability to connect what you may be doing in the classroom to who you might be later on. And so look at programs like the Inspiring the Future program or the Primary Futures program, which operate in a number of countries, where you recruit people from the world of work first, and then make them available to the schools. And then you also need within your education system to make clear that there is an expectation on schools, that this will be a commonplace activity. Now, clearly this shouldn't replace the full guidance systems, which are really important for making sure we have professional, well-trained guidance counselors who have a strong understanding about educational routes and many employment routes and training routes, and are skilled in working with young people and helping them to open up about their ambitions and their thoughts. But we kind of need to make it easy for them. Otherwise, there's a real risk they'll just use their own social networks. And if they use their own social networks, if you're a school in a very privileged location, where you've got a very dynamic labour market around you, the experiences that your students get are going to be very different from students elsewhere.
There are so many things you just said which I want to pick up on. I will pick up on the last point because I think it's an interesting issue. Work experience often goes to those who have links to people in those industries. It's about who you know. It's about social links. So if you want to work in a specific industry and have no connections, the chances of you getting a position are a lot less likely. But you have parents, for example, who do work in that profession, then they can get their kid a placement. So how can you create a more equitable career preparedness support network for all children?
Well, I think the starting point is that we need to understand that this matters. So firstly, as I said, there's growing numbers of longitudinal studies which tell us that the sort of guidance that young people have in schools, the way they explore, they experience, also think about uncertainty, misalignment, so they think about their futures, really does make a difference later on. And then we can look at the data, which we have in PISA and elsewhere, to see there are some real patterns within that. Now, I conceptualize this, and I think we can conceptualize this in thinking about young people developing human, social, cultural capital, which enable them to confidently progress through education towards areas they want to go. And I'll give you an example of where that works really well. And a few years ago, I did a study which took me to some of the most famous private schools in England. These are known around the world. They're schools which produced dozens of prime ministers and so on. I asked them, was career guidance important to them and their students? And they said it was really important. And the thing for them which was most important was connecting their students with people in work who could give them opportunity to have, through career talks, to understand their trade, job shadowing, work placements. And it was really easy for them because the parents and the alumni from those schools were doing the jobs which the young people were really interested in. And so law, finance, government, they found it very easy to connect. It was a simple process for them. And this matters. And we have studies which look at how the social background of a young person links to their ability or their experiences of career development. And in this case of the work placements, the more disadvantaged you are, the less likely, the more difficult it is for you to find a placement linked to those professions which all young people are really interested in. We can see that. But also once you're in there, you're likely to have a worse experience than somebody from that privileged background. We need our schools to be preparing young people over a long period of time to take advantage of the opportunities which they go. Well, what does PISA tell us about this? We would hope that young people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds get more career guidance than their peers who are from the most advantaged backgrounds. But actually the opposite is the case. We ask questions about 9 different forms of guidance, and in 8 of them, it's the more advantaged students. This is on average. Some countries are better than others. In realizing that there is a need to target greater support over those young people whose networks are likely to be weaker, whose access to information might be weaker, whose confidence and understanding these rules of the game might be weaker. And Ireland is a good example. It has a program where it gives double funding for the schools in the poorest areas to support career development activities. And so it's really important to understand that that this is an issue, and we need to see something done about it. And we can use insights from this longitudinal data to check whether we feel young people are progressing well. We can look to see, the proportions of misalignment and uncertainty, and we can look at their participation in some of the activities, particularly those ones which connect the most with people in work, are being equitably accessed. And we would hope, actually, if there is an imbalance, it's in the direction of those young people who've got the most needs.
It's really striking, you outlining just how privileged some students are compared to others and the levels of access they have to engaging in professions, very high profile, high status compared to others. And I think there's a statistic in the report which actually stood out for me, which is that about half of students don't speak to a career advisor by the age of 15. Presumably, these are students who are not, by and large, in those privileged private schools. What is going wrong there? Because do some schools just not consider career guidance that important?
Well, we do see variation across countries within this, but that average has been pretty steady since we've been asking the question. And it is, I think, fits with this view of the world where in many countries, guidance is only really seen as a priority at the end of your education. And increasingly, OECD countries, students stay in secondary education to 17, 18. And at that point, they say, well, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Until that point, just follow your interests, follow what you're good at. And as Andreas Schleicher always tells us, the best guidance takes place much earlier, because it's not just about what you'll study, where you'll work, what you'll do. It's knowing how to apply yourself in the education, how to take advantage of that system. And we see some really striking figures, really chilling figures in the data. We know, for example, that, perhaps it's no surprise, that young people from a high social background who achieve well on the PISA tests are more likely to expect to complete university education than high-achieving students from a low social background. Well, it's quite a big gap. That aspiration gap is very clear. But here's a really frightening figure. Across most OECD countries, low-achieving students who perform so poorly on the PISA tests, we know that they'll probably struggle in tertiary education, from a high social background, are more likely to expect to complete university than their peers who are high-performing from a low social background. And the thing is, we kind of need our education systems to be educating students from a young age what you need to do, how the system works, how you can make it work to your own advantage. And we need to be doing that from a younger age. And so, that Ireland model is a good one. Countries should look at it. And it's something we should continue to collect data on, because the data which we do have is pretty worrying.
It is worrying. And to any teachers listening, if you are at a school which doesn't give career guidance, doesn't do any of the recommendations which Anthony just gave, what is the justification for that? I've been listening to this podcast. Would you call for changes? Let us know in the comments. I want to talk as well, Anthony, about some of the gender issues which were raised in the report. One of the issues we keep hearing about is that many strategically important occupational areas, they're struggling to recruit enough new recruits, and they tend to be dominated by just one gender. And we often see campaigns for certain industries, for engineering or nursing, for example, to encourage young people who are underrepresented to consider such careers. But are those campaigns working?
We looked at 4 areas which have got a lot of attention by many countries as being of strategic importance, with an aging population, with the green transition emerging. with skill shortages apparent. And we looked at a couple of areas, firstly, which are overwhelmingly dominated by men. We looked at the skilled trades, and we looked at information, communications and technology. And in those, we went back in the data for the countries which we have information from all the way back to 2000, and we plotted from 2000, 2003, 2006, all the way to 2018, 2022, because we were assuming that we'd see the gap closing, and perhaps more girls saying that they'd be interested in working in these areas. But what we found was that if you look across those countries we have data for, the gap remained the same. Now, this suggests that we need to take some action, and I'll talk in a moment what sort of things that countries can be doing. But on the other side of the divide, we looked at young people. We looked at people working in teaching and in healthcare, which historically and in many countries are very dominated by women. Men are underrepresented in those areas, and we find in healthcare the gap has actually increased. That we see when we look at those aspirations, those expectations of students about what areas they'll work in. In teaching, it has decreased, but that's not because many more boys are saying they want to go into teaching. That stayed pretty level. It's often about a low number of percent, but girls have become less attracted to teaching, and you'll know very well, Duncan, that around the world there's a bit of a crisis in getting more people into the teaching areas. So, what does this data all tell us, and what does our wider experience tell us about how we can, tackle these gender ideas? Firstly, I'd say that, we have evidence in the data that it's not biological determinism here. It's not that just that, there's something about girls, which means they're not interested in the skilled trades or IT, and boys are not interested in teaching and healthcare. There is certainly a preference, which you see in the data. But in some countries, we find more girls interested in occupations like the skilled trades. Hungary is a good example around the skilled trades, where 5% of girls say they'll work in that area. We see more girls interested than boys. And we can see sort of like some sizable numbers in different countries where the opposite is the case. There are many boys who are interested in these areas. Boys are interested in teaching. And so we don't think it's biological determinism. And it's important. Governments worry about it, societies worry about it. Where are we going to get the skills from? We need more girls to become engineers because we haven't got enough engineers, and we're only recruited from half the population. But it's important for young people because it broadens the possibility of them being able to find areas of work which are more personally fulfilling to them. And one thing I've been doing recently, I did recently before, moving on to a new stage in my career, was surveying young adults, 19 to 26, in 2 or 3 countries, Spain, the US, earlier in the UK, and you ask those young adults, do you wish that your secondary schools had given you more support in your career development? Across a number of areas, and overwhelmingly they say yes, we'd like a lot more support. But one of the questions is around understanding jobs which people like you, people of your gender or background, don't typically do. And big numbers, perhaps more highly girls than boys, but certainly, a third or more say, yeah, I'd love to have found out more. I'd like to have a lot more information about that. But what we see is in countries, some of the more effective approaches, think about, these questions I've been talking about about beginning early, because very gendered ideas begin early. We know actually from OECD work as young as 5, and often it's actually boys who have more strongly gendered ideas about the sort of jobs which they would do than girls. But we also there's a really good program which came out of Estonia, which is called, kind of Break, with a big exclamation mark afterwards, which recognize that we need to critically examine why, certain people do certain jobs, whether if there's any real reason for it, what it might be like to do so. In this, it's important that we address some of the real concerns. Would those workplaces be hostile to somebody from the minority gender? That's a really important one. And then ultimately we need to give them confidence to take a risk. And so this is the sort of thing, talking to people, talking to, a male nurse, talking to a woman who works in construction. What is it really like? What's your experience? Do you think I might be able to deal with that? See for yourself. Take job shadowing trips, do a placement, an internship there. And then we need to do that sort of like early enough in the education system, and we need to do it in a safe way for everybody, of course, but early enough for them to be able to act on the new things which they've learned as they've gone through. Give them the confidence to be able to pursue things which, social pressures might say are not right for me and not right for others. And often the focus here is on girls, and we can see that because girls, routinely do a bit worse in the labour market than you'd expect, given their qualifications and backgrounds. But it has to work for both genders. If it works for both genders, we can move to a way where our education and guidance systems can be empowering, for young people, to give them a broader options in terms of the sort of things which they may pursue and actively help and enable them, to reach those goals.
Okay, I was going to ask you about what policymakers could do, but I think you answered it. So well done for giving such a full answer. Before we go, I wanted to mention that part of this report, there's an interactive element to it on the OECD website. There's a career development dashboard, and explain to those listening, how can educators and policymakers use this dashboard? How is it helpful?
Well, this is the first time in history we've had such a good international comparative resource for people in governments, for schools, to actually look what's typical in their countries and compare it to what happens in other countries. And, it's a wonderful resource. It's called the Teenage Career Readiness Dashboard. It brings to light a lot of the, kind of the data which I've been talking about. It has these comparisons between what young people expect to do in the labour market and whether the actual demand for those jobs is there. It talks about uncertainty, the misalignment and so on. And it's important that people understand why these things are important and look at some of the wider work in the notes and so on. But also it includes students' attitudes about how well they think their schools are helping them to prepare for working life. And that has some further worrying results. I mean, generally about half the students often don't seem to think their school's doing a pretty good job. And I'm sure many schools are doing a pretty good job. But if you look at questions like, or statements like, does school give me confidence to make decisions? 47% disagree. They don't think that. Particularly low performers, people more socially disadvantaged. If you ask them if they worry about whether they're prepared for life after secondary school, 47% say that they are worried. 49% say, on average across the OECD, and again there's variations, that schools done little to prepare them for adult life. And this is the figure which, just really upsets me, to be honest. 1 out of 4 students across the OECD agrees with the statement that school is a waste of time. And what we found from some of our other studies with these young adults, we asked them about the career development they had in education, particularly how much they engaged with employers and people and worked through it. And you see that the more that they recall, the more that they remember that they did, which we think is they say it's quite easy for them to actually to remember, the more likely it is they to agree that school helped prepare them well for working life. And if you saw 4 or more people, you can remember that higher level of engagement. I mean, it should be more than that, but this is towards the high end of our scale. About 2/3 of students think that their school prepared them well. This is data from Spain and from the US and from England. But the other end, if you saw nobody, you're totally in that isolated educational experience, all focused on your results. Only a third of students say that their school prepared them well. It's about much more than the exam results. And these really quite simple things which schools can do really support the building of a far broader preparation for adult life. And we can see those results, and we can see the benefits to young people in the numbers.
There's a whole nother podcast there, Anthony. Thank you so much for joining us. A fascinating conversation, and I think to anyone listening, a real wake-up call as well about some of the major issues which are facing schools right across the world. You have been listening to Anthony Mann, who led the OECD's Career Readiness Project. He was the lead author of the report, The State of Global Teenage Career Preparation. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Anthony. Lovely to see you and to speak to you. And if you would like more information about what we have been discussing, then do check out the OECD website, oecd.org. There is the OECD Career Readiness Project page. On it, you will find the dashboard, which Anthony was talking about. It is packed full of data about student job expectations, about the labour market demand, about career development activities, and much, much more. And you can compare what different countries are doing. If you like this podcast, then please subscribe. But that's it for now. Please join us for another episode of Top Class soon. All the best.